So I want to build factories. I'm an engineer by training, or material scientist. I want to build factories. That's my goal. My vision is, and why I'm doing this is because I want to see a factory that's producing what is essentially a white powder. That's my end game.
Welcome to PEP, the Protect Europe podcast, where we interview founders and investors building the technology that protects Europe's values, way of life, and infrastructure. Hi, Anders. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I already know this is going to be a great episode, right? Because we've already started talking about Web Summit and Slush and founding and investing and all the different stuff that's there. But big thanks for coming on. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Okay, so why we kind of started with Tiotech was we started thinking, why is electrification using batteries going so slow? So being Norwegian, we're used to having really, really cheap power, and looking at kind of how do you move stuff. Electricity is just super, super nice to have. But the big challenge was, how do you store electricity, right? Because if you want to move a ferry, if you want to move something big, you need to store that electricity. You can't have it connected to the grid. And despite Norway being really, really far ahead in terms of electrification or the maritime space, we kind of looked at some of the battery designs, and we kind of realized these batteries are huge, but they don't need to be. So what we had was, at that time, we had a kind of a budding collaboration with a different startup on using our raw materials, our titania, our Titan B, that we kind of call, into batteries. And what we were looking at is saying, okay, if we can make batteries that are super durable, super robust, super long lasting, that's kind of the ideal one for industry, because what they need is uptime. They don't really need super long autonomies. They need really, really high uptimes. And that you can solve by just building smaller batteries that you charge a lot faster. So we started kind of developing in that space. Kind of in the beginning, we did already identify the defense space as somewhere where we wanted to go, because defense is very often in a very different kind of performance, let's call it performance space, than like the EV or the ESS space. But first of all, it's a lot about safety. They don't want to use stuff that can blow up, weirdly enough.
Wouldn't know why. Come on, where's your risk tolerance in the military?
Unless it's supposed to blow up, right? Unless it's supposed to blow up, it shouldn't blow up. That's kind of their whole thing. And we started doing a bit of course, with kind of Ukraine and all of these things, that also changed a lot of the perception on how defense space does innovation. Because if we go back there, when we started really looking into the defense sector, it was like, yeah, you can go there, but you're not selling anything until it's like 10, 15 years down the line, which is way too long for a battery startup, right? But then what's happening in kind of this new space, one, we do have a warm conflict. And that means even more about how do you battle test. You need stuff, you need to get technology there that's battle hardened, call it that, or battle ready. So basically what we have is developed is a battery cell. You can shoot a bullet through it and it won't catch fire, which is brilliant. But you can also still draw current from it. So you could imagine having a battery-powered equipment going into space, into a war scene, being shot and being there, and still having enough power to at least get some way away from that kind of hot conflict. And that's kind of the basic of what we're building. And then there's we're very much in the fundamentals of chemistry and material space. So we've developed essentially what's unique about us is we've developed a new material, but then we're also developing kind of the chemistry around it. What's different from a lot of other companies is we have no ambition of actually building the battery factory. We're working with partners externally to do that. That's both because, one, it's very hard to make batteries, as lots of companies have found out in Europe in the past, and you can partner with companies that do that a lot better than we can ever do. And secondly, it's a logistics operation, right? So instead of us having to build first a factory, but also a logistics operation, what we're focusing on is on how can we become the best in the world at making this material and optimizing this material for the battery space. And then rather than trying to do it all ourselves, we work with the best in class on integrating it.
Okay, I have so many questions. But the first one was something you said right at the beginning, which was you felt that the space was going slow. What gave you that feeling? Other than it was really apparent it was going slow? Because often I think that there is that kind of like people kind of see the reality that they are immersed in. What were those kind of indicators, those little bits of code in your mind that you couldn't kind of unsee?
So the feeling stemmed from kind of seeing how quickly it was going in the EV space, particularly in Norway.
Yeah, you're the EV capital of the world, and I think undisputed on that one.
Exactly, and that kind of meant that led us down the path of saying, well, okay, we've gotten the EV space. Yes, you could argue that it's been driven by lower taxes and all of these things to a certain degree, but also the technology became ready. The technology meant that there's no difference in having a EV that you can plug into your charger every night and have it fully charged than having a petrol car that you have to go to the petrol station and fill up every once in a while. So kind of the ease of use was there. But what we kind of went and said, why when I say going slowly is saying like, okay, one of the first things I heard was one of the ferry operators going on stage saying, okay, I can transport my ferry across the fjord and it costs me less in fuel cost than what it costs to buy a cup of coffee and a waffle on board that ferry. So we were like, okay, but this...
Wow.
So the running cost is basically zero, is what he was saying.
Yeah. Or the coffee and the waffle are seriously overpriced, right? And that's where he's making his money. Let's see where it is.
But we kind of but then we were saying, okay, so why is it still so that the Norwegian government has to have these huge projects or huge sums of money, lump sums of money to pay for infrastructure, to pay for the battery, the batteries on board the ships, on board the ferries, when the technology, I mean, you'd already this was 2017, 2018, you already saw a huge drop in the prices of cells. You saw a huge drop in all of these things. And yet, if you go back and if you now it's been extended, if you look at particularly retrofits, not so much in new builds is kind of now coming along and becoming really good. But if you looked at retrofits, we were retrofitting the same rate we'd done 10 years ago. So we were kind of like, okay, there is something fundamentally slow in this space. And yes, you can argue it's market dynamics, it's a slower market for uptakes and all of these things. But at the same time, we're saying, okay, it's not really that. It has to be something else because all of these things are being put there and being pushed, but the markets are still kind of slower to adapt. And kind of then doing let's call it the Elon Musk thing and kind of going back to the fundamentals, what we said is, okay, in these use cases, it's not really about the energy density and all of these things. It's about figuring out how can you have battery operation 24/7 or battery operation that you can charge in very, very short stops, because it's for a ferry, for instance, it is very much kind of there to there to there to there. And then kind of extending on that, understanding the whole system that you have to put in place. And what we realized is that EVs are perfect for the batteries that we were developing because, one, yes, you need to have some safety systems in place, but if something goes wrong in an EV, most of the time people can just leave. It has doors. If something goes wrong on a ship or in a defense base or an industry, people can't leave. And kind of the consequences of stuff going wrong is that much bigger. So what you end up building a very, very large safety system, which drives cost and which drives then kind of becomes a challenge in operating it, and all of these things becomes what fails. Because that was the second kind of, call it, myth that had to be busted, was saying, okay, battery systems are completely unreliable. And part of it is I'd agree, some cells, it's hard to make good batteries consistently. And it's even harder when you go for kind of the EV space cell, have a chemistry that's unstable. So it's you have to build in these safety systems, but then the safety systems actually become the problem because it becomes more complex. So what we said is, okay, let's build a super safe and durable battery chemistry. And if you can do that, then you can solve all of these downstream issues. And even though you have maybe some downsides that look on the cell level, like lower energy density and maybe some increased cost, you'll actually make that up more than what you thought. So your system actually ends up, that what you pay in the end as the end customer ends up being much less, but because you make the right choices in the beginning. And that's kind of the whole core of the whole why this makes sense, right? Because in the beginning, it's just curiosity. It's kind of driven
it's like,
scientific.
Why do we do the ships thing?
Yeah.
Why is that slower? There's a curiosity thing. I could hear that. And then I was like, oh my God, there's no market because like the guy in his waffle, like that's the cost. So like, how on earth are we going to make money on this one? So now let's go to the chemistry part. what is the choice what's the, classic pros and cons? So if we take what we've got today in the EV and we take what you're building, how do they kind of, overlap, fit together? How different are they?
Okay, so what we're building is using titanium as an anode material. Titania is a chemical that is ubiquitous. Every paint in the world has a certain percentage. Every liter of paint has a certain percentage of titanium. So what we do is, what we've developed is a way of making it titania super small. So we're into the nano range, which means that weird stuff, quantum effects starts taking into place. There's different phases that become stable and all of these things. And that means that you can then all of a sudden store lithium into it, or sodium actually, or a lot of other components are actually being able to be put in and out of this titania, which is, on the macro scale, it's so boring that if you do an intro to inorganic chemistry or kind of materials chemistry, very often they'll use titania as kind of one of the examples because it's so boring and so known.
Okay.
So what we do is we take what I say to is I take.
But is it boring but hiding in plain sight? Something quite
exactly.
special. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
And which is like, don't get me wrong, every investor loves the founder that can see the gold bar lying on the street that 1,000 people walk past. That is like, oh my God, we love that founder because they can see the gold and everybody else has ignored it 1,000 times.
But then it's about how do you control these, and this is kind of then chemical engineering. How do you control your synthesis at different scales and doing different things and understanding some of the choices you make in that scaling of that process and all of these things to understand how do you make it. One, it's a super interesting chemical, super interesting lab performance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can translate that into a battery that works or a powder or a chemical that works. And that's the second part of what we do, is understanding, yes, we've got this really interesting particle. We can show theoretically why it works. We can show that it works decently enough in the lab, but how do we go from having decent lab results to having something that you can produce at ton scale, put it into a battery production line, and then actually make batteries at scale? And I'm not going to say we've sold all of these, but we've taken we're on a very nice trajectory now of scaling internally. We can now make batches. We can basically make on a ton scale, which is megawatt hours of batteries out. And then we're doing validation studies now with a few customers and with also our own internal validation studies to ensure that we can optimize not only our material, but then optimize all of the different components that goes into a battery. So like I said, we're trying to avoid having to produce the actual batteries, but we're still doing the groundworks and laying those ground foundations so that whenever we get a customer or our customers can build on top of that. So we know and we can sell the kind of IP and the knowledge of how do you integrate, but then it's up to the battery producers to then say, okay, I already have this supply chain in place. How do I tweak my formulations, my throughputs to ensure that I can become the best in class in making these batteries? But that's also an iterative approach, because that means that we do something and they come back and say, okay, this works, this doesn't work, which is a lot. Yeah.
I do want to get into the whole capability, what you do, what something else does in a second, but I just want to understand the chemistry. So just explain the chemistry to us, right? Okay. So are you storing lithium or are you storing something else?
Still, it's lithium going in and out. And if you've heard of what you normally hear about is like NMC or LFP or NCA sometimes.
Great acronyms. What do they mean?
Yeah, great acronym. Exactly. Those are focusing on the cathode material. So that's a NMC is a nickel metal, nickel manganese cobalt. NCA is nickel cobalt aluminium. LFP is lithium iron phosphate. What we do is we work on the other part, which is the anode. So a little bit like two reservoirs of lithium in the cell, actually. The anode is what's kind of storing it whilst your battery is fully charged. Lithium goes back and forth. When your battery is fully charged, it's in the anode. There's basically you can roughly divide the battery world then into, when they divide it, but it's 90 to 95% of batteries will have a graphite anode, which is essentially coal, slightly different, but
polished coal.
Polished. Let's call it polished coal, yes. Some of them are using silicon blends or even full silicon. And then there's a small percentage that's using LTO, that's lithium titanate. you already hear there kind of, it's more like the cathode material already, just by the name of it. It's a complex one. What we've done then is you had lithium there. That lithium is dead. It's part of the structure. So that means it's super good at power. It has many of the same capabilities that we do, but it has very low energy density. So what we do is we essentially take the LTO type battery and we bring it up to what LFP can do today, roughly put. But with the advantages that we can charge faster than LFP can today, we can last even longer than LFP, particularly at kind of high power and charging rates, and we're even safer. That's kind of the very short pitch. And then what kind of the whole idea behind it then is, can you compete on cost with LFP? Probably not. At least not before we're at super high scales. But what we do is we use titania, like I said, ubiquitous material. We also use the same raw materials that are in the paints, essentially. Or you can come down to a very low cost in terms of the raw material, and then the processing that we do is special. So the question is, how much value can we bring into the space? Can we bridge all the way down to LFP? Maybe, but that also depends then on the cathode choice that you make. Because the main disadvantage we have is a lower cell voltage than even LFP has. So when you're building a system, essentially what you do is you then have to place more batteries in series to have the same voltage out. And that's one of the reasons why we say we have slightly lower energy density than most kind of, if you go for the really high energy density EV cells, we can't compare. But what we're saying is you can do fast charging or fast cycling for tens of thousands of cycles rather than 1,000 cycles.
Yeah, and also you talked at the beginning around this actually having to have these safety systems because at the chemistry level, do you get an advantage then? Not that you're not safe, in fact, you're safer, but you're safer at a chemistry level rather than a system level. Does that then pull back some of the advantage?
So that's also clawing back a little bit of this, right? So that depends very much on the application. You can argue if you have a kind of something that goes into the fields, yes, it'll claw back a lot of that on the safety system. Maritime space is super regulated. We did show some videos of some of the robustness and some of the testing we'd done to one of the class societies, and they basically went, okay, here's a list of the tests, and if you can meet all of these demands on the cell level, you can literally just put in your battery into the engine room of this vessel.
Okay,
and that's super good.
Yeah. What were the tests?
One of them, we kind of had to go back to them and say, well, this seems a bit unfair, because they wanted us to have it in a fire of 900 degrees for an hour. And we were like, well, if whatever is on fire is there for an hour at 900 degrees, anything is going to struggle. There's no engine that's going to survive that test. And
I was going to say, so hold on. So hold on. How did that test apply to everybody else? Or was that just a special test just for you because you're a special guy?
No, it's not actually a special test, but it's one of these ones where I don't know if it's been kind of some wires got crossed in kind of the safety evaluation scheme, but it's one of the standard tests for batteries. And it's like, but how can you, and we're like, but are you putting kind of other technologies through these tests that you want to put on board ships? And they kind of went, well, yes and no. We're putting equivalent tests. And we kind of went, yeah, but this doesn't really, I mean, if we can survive 10 minutes, I'd be super happy. But it's kind of irrelevant. And they kind of agreed. That's the thing. So that's part of the challenge, I think, on a kind of overall global level, is how do you go about implementing new technology? Is very often you put so stringent regulation around it that it becomes impossible to actually win. But we were working with them on that, on finding a replacement test, really, because in the end it's quite interesting. The different class societies, they to a certain degree write their own rules. They're not actually bound by some external rules. They're bound by some external frameworks that they have to kind of apply on top of this. But to determine what is safe, they kind of have to agree with themselves on what is a safe system. So that's a process we're doing now. In terms of the like I mentioned, you can shoot it. That's actually part of some of these more.
Is that one of the tests?
Not for the maritime space. It is.
I know, because it would have been really funny on the maritime. Like, can we shoot it? Can we burn the hell out of it?
One of the things that we kind of went, well, yeah, fair enough. But we did actually have a really interesting test where we did get a small kind of pack system, and we tried to put it on fire. And the problem was, well, we didn't have the full kind of setup that they wanted us to do. We just wanted to test it, right? And we managed to get it to catch fire, like the plastic housing caught fire, but it didn't actually spread into the batteries. And you could still get voltage out of it, which was really cool. But it was like, okay, but we can't get it to actually catch fire. And that's one of the things, like from a chemistry point of view, the mechanisms on how batteries catch fire is very often you start heating it, and then there's parts of the cell that starts catching fire, and that then it becomes a chain reaction, and then it starts feeding it. And what we have is essentially a chemical fuse. So it's essentially, or an insulator or breaker, whatever you want to call it. You don't generate as much of that kind of first component that can kind of start that chain of events. So of course, if you put it into a battery, into a fire, there are components in the battery that will catch fire eventually. Whether that's after 10 minutes or after an hour, we don't really know. But that's kind of the things that we're figuring out now. But what we see and what we're seeing, like some of these regulations, like I talked about, is we're switching a bit the view from, okay, we're not only seeing batteries as how does it start a fire, but also how does it behave in a fire. And this is where having titania or an oxide as the anode material, like I said, it was a reason why I said graphite is essentially coal. And that's like, if you manage to, if that is in a battery fire, that is a log of coal that can also feed its own oxygen. So you've got no way of putting that fire out until that log of coal is burnt out, basically. What we have is essentially a metal that's been burnt to completion, so you can't burn it further. There's nothing and that's a huge part of the weight. And so you've got some other component, like the electrolytes can still catch fire, the separator can still catch fire, but those are tiny, tiny bits. So it's like having a log of coal versus a small lump of plastics, which melts and do all of these things. So that's kind of the whole, call it the core of why is this technology safer.
And that makes a lot of sense. Let's just step on to some of the numbers. Like, how long have you been doing this? What was the research before you kind of started the company? How many people are in the company? Kind of what stage you are? Because at the moment we've done like the vision and a few of the early curiosities. We've done the chemistry. Now let's kind of put some numbers on it.
So the company started, we have a financing history back to 2016. That was then based on work that started in the 2000s.
Okay.
Essentially in the same company, but that was then kind of rebranded and repurposed and repackaged in 2016. Okay. So the core technology, the core process scaling was already done by then. And then in 2016, like I said, that's the financing of this company, which then meant also a new direction in terms of the batteries and energy storage. Completely different thing we'd done before, but related to paints. And that's quite important, because the first step of making a battery is making a paint. It's actually essentially. So we use a lot of the knowledge that's developed there, repackage it, repurposed it, didn't reinvent the wheel, but tweak the process and tweak, particularly in basically making the particles. And like I said, shaping that into a powder. Started working on that, started optimizing the kind of on the lab scale and the battery electrochemistry. And then about 5 years ago, we raised, for us, what was a significant round, raised about 2.5 million euros, in addition to kind of public rounds, which meant we home sourced a lot of the scaling that we'd done externally. But we just now kind of finished what we're going to do, the first step of that. We started building up our internal competencies from being a founding or a kind of a startup team of 4 people to now being 11. We professionalized the whole organization in terms of having a lot of the quality control, that a lot of the outsourcing we insourced. We've built up now a kind of a fully operational battery lab with also a lot of the quality equipment and all quality checks and all of these things. And also then working commercially from a kind of saying, okay, we're doing this internal development. We're not going to be talking too much, because there's always a risk. This is where kind of the challenge in doing really deep tech versus like the software thing, where you need to basically, you can find a customer that will say, I'll buy once you've developed, and you know it's going to take 3 months of development to build this app or whatever. When we started out, there was fundamental questions on, can it actually be done? Not even can it be done cost efficiently.
Is this the kind of law of chemistry?
Exactly, yeah. And in the end, we kind of went, okay, we believe it can be done, but we also understand how much money is needed to scale and to qualify the core technology. And that was basically around when we raised the slightly larger round. And then it's been a lot of work with customers and with R&D institutions to really define what should the product be and look like to be able to actually sell it. And then also then studies on the cost efficiency. So right now we're raising money to run the pilot, because right now, like I said, we've got a capacity now that can develop ton scale materials, which means you can then go into not only the kind of pre kind of A type cells, you can actually go into A and B and C samples with those type of amounts, but also you can start seeing properly do all of the quality measures that you need to do to move from being a development organization, which we have been and we still are, to being a commercial organization that's driven by yields, by sales, by recurring revenues, and those type of deliveries and things like that. And this is also why we're seeing this whole defense and rather what many people would call niches, but they're huge on the global scale. But it's where we can do projects. So rather than kind of say, okay, we go in and we get one Panasonic factory. To do that, I have to build 100,000 tons annual production. That's really, really tough to do if what you've done is a few kilos or even 100 kilos and stuff like that. If I go in and do a project, it means I have to produce maybe a ton. Maybe I have to produce 10 tons because they've got 10 iterations that they want to do. But it means I can kind of build gradually, learn, and then come back and say, okay, here we got it. And then go to the guys who made it, and they've already pre-qualified you as a supplier. And then they come in and say, okay, well, this is so good, and this is you've shown us the cost curve, and we believe in that. And if we can sign an agreement that if you can deliver, we can pay this in 2 years, then you can build the 2,000 tons per year.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And again, I don't think people are aware of the sums of money that will be involved in the whole NATO pledged commitment thingy. At this point in time, 2025, when we're recording this, Europe has already overtaken the US in terms of the amount of money it's spending on defense procurement. And that's the first time that Europe has overtaken the US in defense procurement spending since World War II. So it's been a while. So, and that's Europe only just getting started in this space. This is the first year of the ramp up. It's Germany basically going first and everybody else doing it. Sorry, Germany and Poland going first and everybody else doing a bit. So we haven't really hit the big sums yet. That's super interesting. Okay, and at the moment you're raising now. How much are you looking to raise?
So we're looking to raise 10 million.
Okay, cool.
It's enough that we can fully validate the process, but it's also enough to get us to the next stage in terms of planning for full-scale production, because that's also how big things get done. Spending a little bit more in the planning phase. We built basically the pilot that we built. We've done most of it in-house. We've kind of identified a lot of the pitfalls and a lot of the things that we know that we need to keep in track of and need to keep our external providers in check. But that's also been a huge learning process, and we've managed to build in lots more flexibility into the process than what you would do in a fully automated system. But that's been the fun bit. But
and that makes 10 million sounds like a good step up, and we need to put real money behind these sort of these opportunities, otherwise they're not going to go anywhere. In terms of then, you mentioned R&D partners, and you also mentioned battery supplier partners. Are they different for you in terms of like the guy, Panasonic, etc.? Are they going to be the potential battery? We're going to produce you a ton of cells this way, and the R&D is somewhat different, or is it both? Are they together?
It's all a spectrum. So we've got everything from we're working with R&D institutions in Europe primarily. We're also working with a Japanese company that's more of an R&D supplier.
Okay.
But they're also so independent that they act as a validator. They're so established. They've got links to Panasonic. They're not Panasonic, but in the end, what comes out of them is seen as kind of, okay, if you go to basically any battery producer. But then we're also working with a few battery producers. One of them is on our website, is Gus Technologies, where we're doing product development and also sales development, because one of the second things we realized is that outside of China, Panasonic, LG, some of these big ones, they're good at selling, but there's a plethora of battery producers that are wanting to understand and wanting to supply goods into the West, but because they're startups, because they're 50 to 100 man operations, they simply haven't got the kind of cultural knowledge and all of these things, which goes both ways. So what we've said and what we've done is we've partnered with a few companies looking at selling battery solutions into Europe and say, okay, let's be your door openers. Let's go in and say, okay, if you've got technology, we'll take that in and already say, let's put that on the market and get it. Because I think one thing is, like you said, we're in a rush, right? And it's one thing kind of having these interesting projects and doing all of these things, but there's a lot of companies that are there really struggling and really needing new technology to be delivered yesterday. And we're not there where we can do that, but we can open the doors. And I think we had a bit of a chat about Americans beforehand, but what I do think Americans seem to be better at than us is saying, okay, let's be pragmatic about stuff. And I mean, if we can sell and if we can make some money and finance that and pay it forward kind of thing in terms of opening doors for others, let's do that. And let's be better at that in Europe. Things.
Americans are extremely pragmatic. I was listening to the acquired guys, Ben and David, did an amazing overview of Trader Joe's. And I lived in the States for a couple of years, Trader Joe's. What I didn't realize is that Trader Joe's basically started as a hardcore liquor store selling scotch and whiskey. Yeah, because their market was going to be flattened. They were going to be taken out of business. The only way they could compete was by selling something that the other guys couldn't sell for prohibition and other reasons. So that's how they stayed in business. Now, Trader Joe's today is granola and wine.
Yeah.
Right? It's not hardcore spirits, but they were pragmatic, stayed in business, kept going, and then sold. They've found their model on that particular basis. Okay, and we mentioned China. Where are you with China? Where does that fit into your equation? Is it oh no China inside, we're Europe, we can't do China? Is it okay, we can have China because they control everything, and if I don't have a bit of China, I'm not pragmatic, I don't get anything? There's probably a spectrum. Where are you on the spectrum is probably that question.
I depends a bit on which week you ask, I guess.
Okay. It's complicated is the way you're saying.
Very complicated. I think the thing is, I mean, and this, I'm going to be that honest from a kind of capital, and we have Chinese equipment because they also, in terms, they're the cheapest and the best when it comes to a lot of battery stuff in terms of testers and all these things, which obviously is a something you think about, at least. If it's not, I wouldn't call it a concern, but it's something you think about, because the battery testers fundamentally are quite simple, but you then have Chinese software. So how do you kind of limit that? That's a huge thing, and it's on our radar. We've also done some testing in China, where the same thing was. We went around, and this was we went around Europe, all of the test centers in Europe, and we basically quoted. I think the cheapest we were quoted was, and fastest was, 18 months wait time, and it was 350,000 euros or something like that for making 50 cells. So not a lot of batteries. We went to China and found one supplier there, and they basically went, okay, you'll have the cells 6 weeks after we're done with them, and you'll pay 10,000 euros. So it was kind of like when it was, okay, I'll go to what was then a defense research institute and say, okay, I've got this offer, and I know that this technology might be relevant for the defense space.
You could say, I've got this offer, can you match it? No.
Yeah. But I mean, I also don't have the money to pay you $350,000. That cuts basically half a year of my runway.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, I can't. We were. I wouldn't say. I mean, you're never forced, right? But it wasn't a sustainable solution to go with the European offers. What has happened in Europe is kind of, obviously, lots of other peoples have faced the same things, and they've built a lot more now financially viable, time viable solutions. Because we found solution. It is kind of like we're really good in Europe to tell this story that we're so slow and we're so non-innovative and stuff like this. But that's kind of one of the things that I've seen happen over 2 years, and it's taken 2 years, but it takes a lot of time to build up the competency and build hardware and build stuff like that. So I was actually surprised at how quickly that came about, to be honest. And then whether that's the good quality or not, yeah, we'll see.
Oh, look, I think it's extreme. Look, that shows the quantum of where we are and where we need to be. Now, will we ever get down to a $10,000 price point and you'll have them in 6 weeks' time or whatever it is, versus 18 months and 350K? That's a big gap to jump. But could we get okay, we are clearly then lacking the testing capability in this space, right? We're not going to build a bunch of companies like yours that are going to scale and capture the value of this layer. And, we're going down the electric stack. We're doing the electrification of everything. So if we don't capture any of that value, thank you very much, China. You've just provided everything for the world, right? And so that doesn't make sense either. Okay, so at the moment, so we've got the 10 million round, which is started, ongoing, etc. Who's an ideal investor for you? Because I think that's very important for founders. You have to kind of go, not who will give me money, but who would I want to give me money?
And in the end, you take the money that's on offer, right?
I know, but I still think you should start from a bit like you did with the chemistry thing. What is the ideal solution? And then let's see if we can make it possible.
I mean, I think the ideal solution is you have to have experience investing in deep tech. So that's kind of the first one. I don't want someone if they say deep tech and I look at their investments and it's all AI companies, I go, not really relevant. Yeah. Ideal deep tech experience and proper deep tech experience building hardware companies from beforehand. Ideally, someone who's worked with batteries or kind of battery adjacent things. So energy storage, those type of investors, those two things. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
And then to couple that, because I don't think they have, very often that's a very limited amount. First of all, it's a very limited amount of investors, but also secondly, they also very often have limited pockets because no LP invests a lot of billions and billions and billions in those type of investors. Someone who's a kind of more a financial operator, but invests then at a kind of FOAC stage. So kind of in that kind of first building up more infrastructure on actual production and understand the financing bit of that and understand the capital stack that you need to have. Couple that with some kind of maybe some institutional debt or something like that in that. I think it's a good mix.
Particularly when you're talking about this sort of area, this is you need someone who's actually bringing a few debt cards to the table. Or debt experience to the table, because I think going forward in your potential business model, however you roll it out, you are potentially able to do some asset-backed securities. There's actual real stuff here that you can actually generate, work with, etc., etc. And most VCs have no debt experience. It's not their game. It's not where they are. It's just pure power law. Give me an Airbnb and an Uber, aggregate, let's go, not vertically integrate. Okay, so that's the kind of pen pointer on the perfect investor. And then just before we finish on that side, what's then the vision for your business? Just so I'm clear. So is it at this stage to basically do this IP level expertise? Are you producing like the designs for stuff, but then the chips are doing out elsewhere? Are you going to go down the full foundry route? You said you didn't want to be a Norfolk 2 because nobody does, right? What's the vision for the business that you're building?
So I want to build factories. I'm an engineer by training, or material scientist. I want to build factories. That's my goal. My vision is, and why I'm doing this is because I want to see a factory that's producing what is essentially a white powder. That's my end game.
Sorry, that could be misconstrued in another podcast of a factory producing white powder. But it's a good line, so we'll keep it in. Hey, the drugs capital of Europe. Let's go.
Yeah, it's my one time going viral was saying that in a local newspaper interview, and I went viral on TikTok for saying that.
Get in.
But then again, the operator in me wants to build factories. And then the question is how do you get this to scale? Because in the end, that's how you bring value. To me, that's how I will bring value. To me, that's how innovation brings value, is if you get it to scale and do that. It's not about getting the huge evaluations and doing all of these things. Those you need because you need to get money, right? You need to finance getting that to the market. So whether we turn this into more of an IP play down the line, maybe, if that's the most sane way of building the factories, right? But what we have now is we have an IP, we have a know-how stack at the bottom there, which allows us to pick. And right now, from kind of all of the business plans and all of the things we're doing, investments are so relatively limited that building factories is very much on the table.
Good.
But that comes back to saying, okay, do I get the right financial partner on board? Because if I have pure VCs coming on board, I doubt that will be the way they want to do it. If I get private equity, if I get someone who's an infrastructure fund and a more industrial owner down the line, then all of a sudden it becomes, okay, well, let's build these factories and let's get going and let's make sure this happens.
And again, I think it all depends on you trying to unlock the value in that particular chain. So one of the companies that I'm really impressed with so far in America, I don't know if you've heard of them. So this is Base Power. So they're based in Texas. And have you heard of them? Not?
I've heard the name, but
so just a good example of a very interesting company. So Texas has a single grid, right?
Yeah.
So America has the 3 grids, East, West, Texas.
Yeah.
Go Texas, right? So it has a single grid. It has the highest level of renewables in terms of concentration. It's overtaken California. So the grid has this now instability that it kind of didn't have when it was oil and gas. So what they've done is they've said, look, we can't really do an awful lot at the cellular level. Basically that bit's solved. We don't add any real value by being the cell guys. We can put all those cells together into a kind of Tesla Powerwall type thing. We can slap it on the side of a homeowner's house who's got the solar panels. And we can become the decentralized electricity provider to basically all of Texas. Now, why have they done that? Well, one, homeowners in most of Texas, and I used to be one, you can just say, yeah, stick the Powerwall on my side. I give you permission. Local authority is not involved. So permission is literally my say-so as a homeowner. Go. I've already got the solar panels, so great. Yeah. Now I sign up with you as electricity provider, and you make sure that I pay the cheapest electricity. And when I'm not using it, you basically sell it back to the grid for me, and I pay less, and I stay independent. And if the grid ever goes down, I got my battery. And you go, yep, that's the deal. Surprisingly enough, in Texas, that's gone super well, right? Because the grid's had its instability issues. So people have had a few shocks. And then people have got big houses with a wall where the swimming pool thing is, and they don't look at it. So the beauty doesn't matter. So a pack on the side is absolutely fine. But I thought what was really good with their model is that they can now buffer the grid. So they are effectively the grid's best friend because they can then manage that. Now, why I like that is that they decided where are they playing. So they decided that they weren't playing at the cell level. There was no value. They were playing at the pack the cells together level. So you need to be able to connect into every single one of these power walls and make sure that you can, when the grid says we need a bit, you can give them enough without compromising individual households. So you're having to do it off the aggregate. And I thought that that was a very smart way of understanding where is the value for them. So they don't need to they need a factory putting the packs together. They need an army of tradespeople who are happy to do this job in hot Texas conditions, and they need to do the telecommunications to make sure that they can meet their promise to the homeowner and meet their promise to the grid. So I think it's finding that, I haven't seen your pitch deck, but I'd love to, but it's finding that kind of what am I building, where am I going framing, that then speaks to that infrastructure investor.
It's very true. And I think that's the part of the key in kind of understanding this materials, which essentially is a materials play. It's essentially a chemistry play. That's the foundation of it, and kind of understanding how does this technology then fit into the bigger picture. And that's about understanding then, like you said, what is the end users. I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of companies doing very similar things. It's also about the kind of the maturity of the idea and maturity of the customers, right? And that's where we're seeing a lot of customers that we're talking to, even though we're a materials player, so we don't really do batteries. That's kind of the weird thing, right? We do batteries, and if you look at our webpage, we kind of look like a battery company. But when we talk to them, the guys who've never thought about batteries aren't normally the ones that we need to talk about, because they go and they listen and they read about 90% market share, and they go and talk to Siemens or some of the big ones, and they've got their value chains and they've got all of these optimized. So they'll sell them the square pegs for the round holes. Very often what we do is we go to the guys who've had a bit of experience with their existing batteries, realized a few of the downsides that we kind of felt that analysis that we did 10 years ago, And when we come to them and say, okay, but what if we thought this way about the next project? They go, yes, this sounds like a good idea. And they kind of go, yeah, I'd rather want to have something that's more for purpose. But that's what I think is happening in the energy storage world is there's so many different end users that we're electrifying at the moment that it's not a one size fits all. I mean, it's CATL already is offering 3 or 4 different battery chemistries, 20 different products into the end markets, just because they are seeing the same thing that we need to diversify. The same pack or the same chemistry that goes into long haul heavy duty isn't necessarily what's needed in the 3-wheelers. Whereas the whole debate very often on investor level, it seems to be that debate is kind of that is missed. I think in lots of the financing bit is saying, we only care about EVs. And the problem with EVs is, and the ESS stage is, already today we're seeing razor thin margins for battery producers.
Yeah.
And you need to scale just at such a pace that I don't think for a startup, at least it brings up that execution risk is just through the roof compared to what it was 10 years ago, where it maybe flipped on the other side around. But I think that's what is also dawning on a few of the investors now is kind of we need to, like you said, Base has already realized the core technology for many of these applications is solved. For ESS, for EV, we don't really need, I mean, this is where I kind of like solid state batteries has become a nice to have in many of these applications. Apart from that, that is maybe the key to solving aviation. But in the EV space, yeah, I think there's so many cars now with like 500 kilometers range, which is good enough for like 90% of the use cases. And that was one, it's my favorite quote from doing. So I did a course on kind of innovation and technology adaptation. And we had the classic lecture of VHS versus Betamax. And the only thing I remember was our lecturer standing at the end of that class saying, good enough is good enough. You engineers, you all want perfection, but good enough is good enough. That is the case. Nobody buys perfection. They buy good enough.
Exactly. Good enough that could be produced at massive scale.
Yeah.
Okay. So we need to wrap because you've been amazing. Let's finish off with, who in this space do you admire? Who is building or investing in this sort of area that is on your kind of worthy of a shout out list?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long list, but I'd like to give a shout out to Emilia Åsberg, who's the CEO of Havgard. And I mean, she's also running a lot of these networking stuff for defense sector in the Nordics. And I think she's been amazing. She's developing, we talked a little bit about communications just before starting the recording, and the Havgard is developing a new way of communicating subsea and wireless, doing a lot of interesting stuff. And they've been part of the Diana Accelerator and all of these things. So they've done a lot of things. I think she's really, really exciting. She's done a PhD at the same time as starting a startup. And just to do that, you have to be a specialist of crazy.
Yeah. That's just, okay. She's already, so to be a founder, you have to be mad. To do a PhD, you also have to be slightly mad. And to do both at the time, clearly there's a problem. Something
is off, but she's getting stuff done. And that's just simply amazing.
That is fantastic. That was a great shout out. So look, Anders, super excited to have you on the podcast. Definitely want to follow up in at least a year's time to find out the amazing progress you had. Very good luck with the round. I'll help as much as I can behind the scenes and see if we can get this one closed for you. But thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you, Colin.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. To make sure you catch us again, please follow us on your favorite podcasting platform.